The symbolic maps that form in our minds correspond to the various biological, social, emotional needs for survival. For instance, we need to recognize nourishment and antagonism. Words like food, beauty, and love are tokens of this necessity for nourishment. They refer to the nutritional needs that support various physical and social aspects of nourishing and protecting coherence as we move along our developmental journey. We see the story told by objective forms and their relationships to one another in nature reflected in the subjective stories we tell ourselves on many levels. Our social group structures are stitched together by stories, defined by such role concepts as mother, father, protector, ruler, and slave. We also have relationship descriptors like nourisher, protector, predator, prey, and so on. These ideas are symbols that capture the notion of the necessity for a structural womb with an umbilical attachment to the larger environment that delivers the selective necessities of survival over time. The attributes we associate with these symbolic tokens are inclined to be tailored toward mapping the nature of our being as well as the necessities for our continuation and development over time. We map out and share ideas across the group culture to better nourish and protect ourselves over time. One of the more prominent plots embedded in the larger story told by nature and reflected in our symbol maps is the need for a savior-rescuer role. As humans, we're born helpless. In fact, we are the most altricial organism on the planet. As completely dependent creatures in the womb and well after birth, we need dedicated tenders to survive. Because we also die as individuals, newborns, cultivated to maturity, are necessary to nourish and maintain the larger social body of which we are part. It is a story of sacrifice and journey. These pragmatic physical expressions are subjectively captured in the form of our cultural myths. And these stories that present themselves as orienting maps for groups to undertake the journey toward the future are built on these objective communication forms from which we are composed. These stories involve the necessity for a proper sacrifice and a certain threshold of dedication to each other as part of the cost to continue living and developing. This is why sacrificial behavioral motifs are present in every human society throughout the world. When the pragmatic reciprocal necessity of being, from our perspective, meets our sensory capacity to map the world with categorical abstractions, we begin building idea structures such as religious doctrines and scriptures that reflect these objective relationship necessities. We develop patterns of thinking that are symbolic representations built on the objective map expressed through nature. But these maps also reflect antagonism. In other words, we can hold destructive ideas and express destructive behaviors. Nature is an expression of the selective properties that lend themselves to a journey toward greater coherence, as well as an expression of antagonists in relation to that journey. Another expressive plot communicated through the object relationship field we experience as nature is the value of proportion. Too much or too little water threatens our integrity. We must have it in specific quantity, in specific interval ranges, at specific temperatures, and so on. This same property of proportional ranges that support coherence applies to all other biological necessities that define our being. For instance, the savior-rescuer necessity also has a contextual aspect that coexists with it. A child's development can be diminished or destroyed by an over- or underabundance of savior-rescuer behaviors. The proportion required is based on developmental context. The need diminishes as we mature. What was once constructive, vital, and necessary can become destructive. Savior-rescuer behaviors that continue out of proportion with local needs become expressions of chaos, out of context with developmental needs. This idea map of savior-rescuer and the influence of proportionality shows up in many self-similar forms. We can draw destructive comfort by averting our eyes from the fear of the unknown, using the illusion of knowing. We can develop a set of focal prejudices that render a clear image, but not necessarily a useful or accurate one. We can hide this comforting womb lit by the campfire of false certainty and sacrifice our ability to effectively negotiate the reality of the journey we're on. We must be vigilant. We use ideas as currency to establish a place in the social economy that we also erect as a reflection of nature's full spectrum story. The same way nature uses the relationships between forms as a means of expressing ever more coherent forms, we express this same motif in the subject domain, using ideas as the currency of coherence. The same way certain objects are attracted to each other, we attach ourselves to certain ideas that nourish and develop the useful patterns that lead to a more mature form. Ideas, in proportion to the context of social environmental necessities, enable us to establish a place in the social economy. We form coherent entities out of ideas such as governments, laws, and the cultural myth stories of savior-rescuer avatars that promise to lead us to promised lands in exchange for sacrificial obedience. We orient ourselves as groups around these ideas that are a mirror image of the necessities of remaining coherent in the context of the natural environment. The natural map, in all its objective forms, is reflected in subjective forms through our abstract maps. The same way mutually beneficial relationships that increase adaptive strength coexist with parasitic and predatory relationships that depend on these emergent growths to sap the necessities of their coherence, we see the spectrum of relational motifs expressed on our social landscape. For instance, our natural and necessary desire for savior-rescuer avatars in certain contexts is sometimes exploited out of context by marketers who craft emotionally pregnant promises of better worlds or protection from antagonists with various widgets, potions, and whatnot. We are increasingly inclined to look for the promise of a savior-rescuer avatar when we perceive danger and uncertainty. While there are real dangers and uncertainty, this reaction can be drawn out and exploited with an emphasis that is disproportionate to the necessities of a given context. The term fear, uncertainty, and doubt, sometimes expressed as FUD, is the name of a propaganda technique used in a number of social contexts. We see it in areas such as sales and marketing, news media, public relation communications, politics, and in the formation of groups that become fanatically inwardly focused by way of attachment to certain ideas with a fear, uncertainty, and doubt bonding agent. The strategy of using FUD in social contexts to nudge behaviors is typically aimed at influencing perception maps into a reduced effectiveness state, using appeals to our natural fear circuits, then asserting the need for certain behaviors such as trust the authority to tell us what to do as the proposed means to effectively deal with that manufactured state of diminished capacity to reason. Highly charged emotional circuits reduce our capacity to render higher-order thoughts. We become more reactionary and can more easily get caught in an ideological feedback loop, becoming paralyzed. Fear circuits in our biology were laid down by the necessities of contending with parasitic, predatory, and other destructive agents. It is possible to deliberately stimulate these circuits as a parasitic or predatory tactic. All relationship influences have a capacity for constructive or destructive expression that is determined by the context in which they are expressed. Again, nature is language. To further illustrate the evolution of verbal maps as they journey from a closer relationship to the objective sources from which they are born to the present day more developed meanings, we can consider the evolution of the words yin and yang. These are typically associated with the familiar yin-yang symbol called taijitu. Taijitu means image of the great ultimate. The symbol is composed of a white and black droplet-like shape that each protrude into each other with a circular dot of each other's presence also within the other. The words yin and yang and the taijitu symbol, which now represent the all-encompassing whole of nature, had humble beginnings. Yin and yang began its meaningful life as a description of the shaded and sunny sides of a hill. It described a range of specific object properties associated with a mound of earth. This useful direct reference to the properties of a specific object grew over time. It developed to also mean shady, dark, and cool versus sunny, bright, and warm. And as it grew, it came to represent contrasting aspects of many kinds that could be applied to still more objects, such as presence and absence, clarity and mystery. And finally it matured into the full spectrum of contrasting properties that contextually define all coherent objective forms. This full spectrum meaning came to be physically expressed as the symbol we know today as taijitu, the image of the great ultimate. All objective expressions have a defining set of specific properties that can act on these forms. This combination of object and properties generates the expression. Objective forms that are acted on by properties can be sounds, letters, chemicals, or atomic elements. Sounds can be warm, cold, loud, soft, and so on. Letters can be ordered or chaotic. Chemicals can be reactive or inert, and so on. The constraints on these forms also determine how objects relate to each other, and which environmental contexts will produce coherent, patterned relationships or not. The forces of nature, as well as the grammatical rules that define verbal languages, are examples of the expressive nature of constraint properties that act on objective forms. Grammar is at the core of every relationship economy capable of coherent expression. Coherence emerges from the influence of fundamental forces or rules on objective forms. This emergent expression generates meaning. It produces subject from object, meaning from raw materials in ordered relationship with one another. Meaning arises from relationship environments with grammatical boundaries that define which relationships will emerge as coherent and which will not. The birthplace of meaning is by way of relationships between objects governed by principles. Yin and yang is a model that also represents the mutually defining role of objects in relation with one another, another global property of natural expressions.